As Ukraine presses its counteroffensive against Russian occupying forces in the south, Moscow's doing some nuclear muscle flexing, conducting military exercises simulating response to a nuclear attack, and accusing Kiev of planning to launch one. Russian forces in the southern region around Kherson have been moving injured people and civilians out of the city, but it's unclear whether the troops themselves are bracing for battle or preparing to flee. Meanwhile, Moscow claims Kiev's getting ready to detonate a dirty bomb laced with radioactive material, a charge Ukrainian leaders deny, saying Russia's describing its own intentions. So on To the Point, we're asking, the ruse with the dirty bomb a sign of Putin's weakness? Hello and welcome to the Point. It is a great pleasure to greet our guests. Jessica Berlin is a geostrategic expert with the German Marshall Fund. Gustav Gressel is Senior Policy Fellow and Military Expert at the Berlin Office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And joining us online from Bonn is my Ukrainian colleague, Roman Goncharenko. He's working for DW's Russia desk. And Roman, I'd like to go straight away to the situation in Kherson, because there's mixed signals emanating from that region, where Russian occupiers have at the same time been sending dire messages about an impending Ukrainian attack, and at the same time also appear to be digging in, bracing for battle. So can you give us your assessment of what is going on there, and also of why Kherson is so strategically important?
Well, let me start with this latest point that you've mentioned. Kherson is extremely important for both sides. It's important for Russia because it is the only point in Ukraine which Russia managed to cross the Dnipro River, the biggest river in Ukraine, which divides the country in two halves, in east and west. And it is very difficult to cross. It's a natural barrier. And Russia managed to cross Dnipro in the early days of the invasion. And from this place, it is planning to go further west towards Mykolaiv, which is a neighboring city, and Odessa, which is an extremely important port for Ukraine on the Black Sea. And if Russia succeeds, Ukraine would lose access to the Black Sea. So it is extremely important for Russia to hold Kherson, to be on that right bank of the Dnipro River. And it is extremely important just from the opposite side for Ukraine to get it back. And it is also important because it's very close to Crimea, to the annexed Crimea, where Russia is getting supplies with fresh water from the Dnipro River. It is also from the region of Kherson. So it is the focal point of this war for both sides.
So, Roman, if I can
just shortly, I think we are at a point where Ukraine would like to continue its offensive, which it started a few weeks ago or a few months ago, the preparations, but it is very slow, and Russia is on the tipping point. Russia wants to defend Kherson, not to lose it, and it is preparing to defend it, but it could be forced to leave it.
So just very quickly, if you would, when could the battle for Kherson take place? Because, as you say, the Ukrainian forces haven't made real advances in the last few weeks.
Well, there is a rather small window of opportunity for Ukraine here. I think 3 or 4 weeks, because the Russian mobilization started in late September, will need some time to show effect on the battlefield. At the moment, Ukrainians have a chance to start the assault on Kherson. But then bad weather and Russian mobilization could stop Ukraine or make it much more difficult to retake the city. So at the moment, we are at a situation which is very volatile, which is very dynamic, and it is impossible to predict which side will win in the coming weeks.
Gustav, the head of Ukraine's own defense intelligence agency has downplayed expectations or hopes that Kherson might soon be liberated, saying that he does not see the Russians truly preparing to leave. Is that just expectation management, do you think, or is it realistic?
No, it will be a hard fight. I mean, there are defensive preparations. You see them digging lines outside of the city. You see them preparing some of the outskirts, the buildings to reinforce them, to sustain shelling and to basically turn houses into fortresses. On the other side, there are swapping troops. There is now one pontoon bridge that operates across the Dnieper River. It is used for quotation mark evacuation to have civilians crossing that bridge all the time, because as long as civilians are crossing, Ukrainians won't fire at this bridge. And this bridge then is also used for military purposes. That is bringing out experienced personnel, especially the paratroopers, because they need them elsewhere, and bringing in freshly mobilized fresh troops. These fresh troops are, of course, weaker, less experienced, less tough, but of course they have to perform static defense. That's tactically not very difficult. So Russia is posed to...
Is that a way of saying they are cannon fodder?
Of course they are. Russian mobilized forces are cannon fodder. And Russia will hold this city as long as it can afford with these troops. But on the other hand, they put their elite forces elsewhere in order to have, again, an operative reserve to contain Ukrainian counteroffensive that are expected elsewhere to follow.
Jessica, meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky is saying that his people should prepare for what he called the most difficult winter in their history. That hardly sounds like he's expecting victory anytime soon.
Well, the difficulty of this winter goes far beyond just the battle for Kherson. As we've seen in the past weeks, the Russian military has been targeting civilian infrastructure as well as military targets, destroying power plants, heating infrastructure. So right now, 30% of the country is without power, and the rest of the country is experiencing planned rolling blackouts to protect the grid and conserve power. And right now, it's October. It's getting cold, but the coldest is still, of course, yet to come. So this will be an incredibly difficult winter, both on the battlefield, but also on the home front.
And we have an example of the concerns about the sensitivity of infrastructure. Let us take a closer look now at the situation in the region around Kherson, which Russia occupied in the early days of the war and illegally annexed at the end of September. And as we heard just now, Kherson is a strategic prize for whomever controls it.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south is apparently putting the Russian occupiers under increasing pressure. Images from a Russian state broadcaster. Administrators loyal to Moscow are transporting people from the city of Kherson across the Dnieper River. They call it evacuation in anticipation of Ukrainian attacks. Kiev speaks of forced resettlement. Kherson is strategically important. If it becomes Ukrainian again, Russia would not be able to advance further west as planned. Ukraine, in turn, would advance toward Crimea. Russian troops west of the Dnieper have been in a difficult position for some time, as the Ukrainian army has destroyed important supply routes. Now the massive Kakhovka dam is at risk of becoming a weapon of war. Since March, the facility has been in the hands of the Russians. Ukraine accuses them of mining the reservoir and warns that if it were blown up, it would cause a deadly flash flood for hundreds of thousands of people. The Russian side claims that it is Ukraine that wants to blow up the dam itself. How weak is Putin's army in Kherson?
And let me put that question straight to Roman. We heard Gustav telling us just now that, in fact, Russia has been removing some of its most experienced officers and troops and replacing them with these newly recruited, inexperienced young men. What do you think? How long could such forces defend occupied Kherson?
Well, it is difficult to assess because we do not know the whole picture, how many are mobilized, how many are experienced of the Russian troops there. From what I hear on Russian state media, there is this feeling that we will not give up, we will not pull back, we will defend Kherson because it is so important for Russia when you think of Russian history. Just to remind you, it is the city where the Russian Black Sea Fleet was built. The first ships were built there. So it was important in the 18th, 19th century for Russia. So you hear such tones. Some people even compare Kherson with Sevastopol, where the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is. So when you hear this, it is hardly imaginable that Russia is preparing to withdraw from the city. So I think they'll just trying to win some time, some weeks, when they have more forces and when the weather, with the winter coming, will make it more difficult for Ukraine to move forward.
Jessica, let me come to these claims swirling around the Kakhovka Dam, which is at a key hydroelectric plant. You mentioned infrastructure earlier on, near Kherson. President Zelensky said that his government has information that the Russians have mined the structure. And Russia, meanwhile, is accusing Ukraine of planning to attack the dam. So are these just verbal tactics designed to throw the other side off balance? Or do you think this discussion signals a major escalation in the offing?
Well, it's a bit of both. Of course, it's part of the information war, but it undermines it shows the undermining of the Russian military tactically. If Russia is needing to destroy infrastructure, if they're threatening to if they're putting out rumors of dirty bombs or threatening the dam, which of course would not only destroy a major power source, but would also flood an area where hundreds of thousands of people live. This would be a catastrophic attack if this infrastructure were destroyed. They're showing that tactically on the battlefield they're weakened and therefore needing to use these kinds of threats to try to get Western support to back off. This is really what's going on at play. So it is a credible threat. It is something we have to take seriously, but it's also something that's being used to shape the narrative of fear and deterrence in this war.
Gustav, staying with the strategic and tactical side here, destroying the dam would create major flooding, as we heard in the report, and as Jessica has pointed out. It would also destroy an important power plant, put it utterly out of commission. Who would have any real strategic advantage from that, given the fact that the Russians are the occupiers? Don't they also need this dam and this power plant to remain in operation?
The Russians don't need the power plant, but they need the dam for the water for Crimea. The channel that supplies Crimea is built from that reservoir. And as long as water levels are high enough, you can tap water and pump it or let it flow downwards to Crimea. So they will not destroy it unless they feel they have to. Of course, if they completely lose the Battle of Kherson, if this sort of things are beyond repair for the Russian army, they might explode it just to drown a lot of Ukrainian soldiers and to drown Ukrainian assault forces equipped with heavy equipment, which for Ukraine is irreplaceable. Tanks are irreplaceable because they get none from the West. Infantry fighting vehicles are irreplaceable. So there is a military purpose. They would also drown some of their own defenders, but if the situation is lost, they don't mind for that.
The concern arising due to the war of words over the dam pales in comparison to unease over Russia's nuclear muscle flexing. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu recently called his counterparts in the US, France, and Turkey to voice his alarm about what he called possible provocations by Kiev involving, we just heard it mentioned, the use of a dirty bomb. That is, a bomb laced with radioactive substances that Kiev would then seek to blame on Russia.
We have concrete information about those institutions in Ukraine, those scientific institutions that are capable of creating this very dirty bomb. The information we have verified through the appropriate channels is that this is not a groundless accusation. If Russia calls and says that Ukraine is allegedly preparing something, it means one thing. Russia has already prepared all this. I believe that the world should react as harshly as possible now. If Russia continues to up the ante and prepare for the next level of escalation, It must recognize that the world will not allow it.
Бруду має побачити, що світ це не проковтне.
Gustav, before we start talking about what this means, just tell us, please, what exactly is a dirty bomb and what kind of harm could it cause?
A dirty bomb is a conventional bomb, basically explosives, and the splinter filler is not metal to cause physical damage. It's made up, composed of radioactive material that will then spread in the immediate environment where the bomb is detonated. Usually it is intended as a terrorist weapon. It has no military value. It has no destructive potential. It has no impact on military operations as such. It would be like a minefield. It would block a certain terrain for movements, but that's it.
Would it leave a radioactive effect that would essentially make that zone uninhabitable or unusable for some time?
It would make a certain zone unusable. Of course, it depends on the size, on the composition, on the way it is detonated, on the altitude it is detonated. But it would basically make a smaller area uninhabitable. But that's it. It's, of course, the long-term effects are worse than a minefield because it's easier to clear a minefield, but the immediate military effect is that of a minefield.
So next fact-based question, is there any evidence that Ukraine does have such a weapon and might be planning to use it?
This is all bogus nonsense. There is no preparation for making such a bomb, and it would make absolutely zero military sense for Ukraine to even think about that. It is complete propaganda, and
And Jessica, what do you think about Russia? Might they have a dirty bomb, and might they be considering using it? It wouldn't be the first time that Russia has accused someone else of doing something that, in fact, it itself plans to do. And we do know Russia just conducted a military drill simulating a response to a nuclear attack, but that, in fact, included a nuclear strike in response. So what do you think?
Well, precisely as Gustav said, the proposition from Lavrov that Ukraine would be doing this and planning this is completely farcical. It's complete bollocks. But from the Russian side, this is a signal, this is a threat. We have these in our arsenal. We would be willing to use them. At the end of the day, this is a further sign of the weakness of the Russian position on the battlefield. This threat is meant to change the narrative and to move the fear of Western governments and Western voters to try to reduce support for Ukraine. It's another classic example of Russia pushing a lie, some fantastic nonsense into the media. Then it gets picked up, reported on, discussed. Does they mean it? Do they not? And they create in this way and help shape the narratives across the world. But what we actually need to see here is that this is another lie, another threat from a government whose word has become meaningless.
So let's talk about what effect that narrative is having. Roman, how are people in Ukraine reacting to Putin playing, and of course his henchmen, playing the fear card?
Well, people remain calm, but still they are worried. And for the first time since the beginning of this war, I saw that people really think that it is possible for Russia to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, something people denied in the beginning. They didn't believe it can happen. But after Russia annexed those 4 regions of Ukraine, 2 in the east and 2 in the south, after Russia threatened to use all it can, including nuclear weapons, if Ukraine continues to fight on the territory which Russia now believes is Russian. So people were discussing this. They were thinking about their plans, what they would do, how they would protect their children, their families. The government made some remarks on that and said, stay calm, but you should know what to do. There were preparations of shelters in Ukrainian cities for that case. But still, on the large scale, I would say that Ukrainians remain rather skeptical. They don't believe that Russia would do such a thing because it is too dangerous for Russia itself. Russia is not so far away. And to detonate a nuclear bomb or to bomb Ukraine with a nuclear weapon, be it a tactical weapon or any other kind, it would mean it is too high a risk for Russia itself or its neighbor Belarus.
Let me ask Gustav whether you would agree with that assessment. As he mentioned, Vladimir Putin has said that he is prepared to use any weapon in Russia's arsenal to defend Russian territory. And now that he has annexed Kherson and several other regions, he considers those to be Russian territory. On the other hand, U.S. intelligence services say that they do not see evidence that Russia's nuclear posture has changed. So what are you expecting to the extent that you can assess?
Well, I second the U.S. assessment. We have very closely watched the preparation of the now nuclear exercises. We have very closely watched a test of a nuclear drone Russia has tested in the previous month, and we could very well trace the movements of fissile material, of reactor cores, etc. So we know when Russia moves something, and if Russia moves something, we can pick up, or the Americans can pick up the red telephone and make a call. But Russia will make nuclear noise, and it does so because it knows that this is the only convincing argument they can make to deter the West from supporting Ukraine. And unfortunately, we are providing them with evidence that this argument works. Chancellor Scholz himself said numerous times that he doesn't want to lead Germany into World War. That World War needs to be avoided.
Did you say he is succumbing to the fear card?
Biden himself did that. He has a very, very untalented wording in his own articles and speeches. There is noise in the White House that this is to be taken, sort of that the Americans are even taking this much too seriously, and that we give too much room to this kind of intimidation. The Russians see that we still hold back decisive military equipment for Ukraine. So they see that the fear-mongering works, and so they do more of that. It works for them.
We heard President Zelensky there saying the West must harshly react, Jessica. We did hear President Biden saying that he has communicated directly to the Russians that it would be a grave mistake, in his words, to resort to any type of radioactive weapon. We heard the foreign ministers of France, the UK, and the US also sending very clear messages. But is it enough?
No. Those words need to be backed up with hard actions. More weapons for Ukraine, more offensive weapons for Ukraine. They need tanks, they need more air defense, and the Western partners need to give it to them. This is the only thing that Putin will react to. He's watching the messaging coming out of Washington, out of Berlin, out of Brussels very closely. And the speeches have zero effect on him. The only thing that will change the dynamic in this war and give Putin a same taste of some of the fear and intimidation that he is so successfully spreading across NATO is to show that we are delivering results quickly and that Western support will help Ukraine secure a decisive victory within the coming year. But unfortunately, the speeches and the comments, yes, of course, it's important to say, if you make this step, the results for you will be catastrophic. But we need to back that up with action in real time and giving the Ukrainians the support they need to stand up to the Russian offenses. And a further point, just on this entire narrative, even the fact that we are now breaking apart and talking about the Russian dirty bomb stories is a part of showing how effective this strategy is. They, in a way, are able to shape the narrative of this war by taking these kinds of proactive steps, by putting stories out there. And we need to become collectively, across the pro-Ukraine alliance, much more effective in simply dismissing these statements out of hand.
But isn't that also what we're doing when we media talk about these issues? Don't we need to give people the facts about, for example, what a dirty bomb is and is not?
Sure, break down the facts, let people know, but I think the leading point needs to be that we don't even give Lavrov the media airtime when he's putting this stuff out there. It's part of the problem. We're treating the Russian narratives on equal footing as the statements coming out of Kiev, and that's a mistake.
Let me just bring in a few viewer comments in the very little remaining time that we have. We received several comments from YouTube viewers in response to last week's show. For example, this one. At this point, this conflict is no longer about just Ukraine. It seeks to answer the basic questions. Can nations with nuclear weapons blackmail those nations that don't? And you better believe China and North Korea are watching this closely. And another viewer says, this viewer is Fintux. The thought that letting Russia get its will would make the West somehow safer or make things better in general is completely out of touch with reality. Roman, do you think that, clearly these are viewers who share the consensus here on the panel, but do you think that citizens in the West can remain steadfast in view of the ruse that the Russians are using?
Well, most of them can, yes. There is a minority which is susceptible to such Russian propaganda, but most of them can and they will, yes.
And very briefly to our guests here in the studio, our title was The Ruse with the Dirty Bomb, a sign of Putin's weakness. Gustav?
Weakness.
Absolutely, weakness.
Thank you very, very much to all of you for being with us once again on To The Point. Thanks to our viewers for joining us. And please do check out our show on YouTube and send us your comments. We'd love to hear them. So please do share them below. Take care and goodbye for now.